You're listening to Stimulus Tech Talk, a conversation-based podcast created by Stimulus Technologies that covers a range of topics related to business and technology.
Welcome to Stimulus Tech Talk. I am Sherry Lip, Marketing Manager at Stimulus Technologies, and I am here with Stimulus Technology CEO Nathan Whittacre. And today we're going to be talking about disaster recovery in manufacturing, because we talk a lot about offices and people sitting at desks and working on computers all day, but not all businesses have that, but they all still have tech issues and things that need to be addressed. So welcome, Nathan.
Oh, thanks, Sherry.
Let's talk about manufacturing. And a lot of people might just think of manufacturing as a big old factory, but of course, they probably have a lot of technical and computer operations.
Yeah, I've actually had a lot of experience consulting and working with manufacturers over the years. And it is definitely an interesting and different environment. You're integrating a lot of systems that are either very modern and integrating with some really old systems. And that's one of the things we find in manufacturing, probably a lot more than any other location. You know, there's smart equipment, smart machines that do and assist with manufacturing. You know, the machines have, integrated computer systems, and those get old, just a few years ago I was consulting with a company that had machines that were still running Windows NT back from the 90s, and there was no upgrade path to get new control units for these machines. And the equipment was perfectly fine and did its job, but it had a very old and antiquated operating system that was driving it. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face in a manufacturing environment is this mix of, very modern software and equipment and technology that has to interface with very ancient, sometimes in computer terms, equipment. And that is a difficulty. And we've had to work around a lot of those problems as I've consulted with companies over the years to still have security and also functionality for all those systems together.
So what are the biggest risks for systems like that, especially if you're talking about old and new together?
Well, one of the risks is a cybersecurity issue. You know, if you're dealing with outdated operating systems, Windows NT again hasn't been around since the 90s. It's certainly not patched. You can put it on the network. The issue is now that is a huge security vulnerability, easily hacked, and if it has direct internet access, it can cause a major outage in the entire network. So that's one of the biggest issues is you have these old systems and you need to have them talk to modern systems to transmit. Let's say it's a production machine like a press brake or some type of laser equipment. Think of manufacturing floor, a CNC, something like that, and it's got to get the drawing files and the files from the engineers, and usually they're going to want to transmit those over the network. But if you have that accessible to the public internet, those machines, it's a huge security vulnerability. So that's one of the big challenges. And then you run in because of that, you run into this issue that you're running these antiquated systems that need to communicate with more modern environments. You're maybe moving data to the cloud, modern file structures. Those old systems can't access that, and so you have to put these bridges in place. Maybe old style FTP servers, or different things that are not have modern authentication in place. And so you just run into a lot of these issues that things don't talk together well anymore. It's interesting. I mean, heck, it's even like some machines run off of serial cables, and so you have to have portable machines or these control units that speak old serial technology. Not serial like eat for breakfast cereal, if you're listening to this, old interface between systems. And so like pre-USB. So it's interesting that these things are still out there, and it really challenges the IT environment to make all of that work together and talk with each other. On top of that, it's, one of the things that I find with manufacturing is they usually have an engineering team, and engineering software is complex and needs a lot of updates, a lot of different tooling and technology that built into that. Very complex, high-end machines are usually involved, and then huge amount of data storage, usually in manufacturing too. Some of these 3D CAD software like SolidWorks that requires a lot of storage and a lot of capability. And so, you're dealing with usually on-site servers and on-site storage. So the ability to move that data to the cloud is difficult just because of the size of those files, and they really need to be held locally so that they can be used effectively. So, and thinking about all this, that those are some of the biggest things that I've experienced working with manufacturers over the years.
So before we get into it's like some unique threats or risks with manufacturing, is it a lot of manufacturing companies might have a group of people who do work in an office type environment, but they also might have hundreds of employees who don't. Does that give a special challenge for access and like do those employees have access to computer or they don't or some? How do you work with that?
Yeah, it often is balanced. The manufacturers I've worked with, usually the floor workers, the ones that are running the machines, may or may not have access to the computer network. They might have like a shop foreman or production foreman that would have access into the computer systems. One of the challenges that come with that, though, is they may need access to certain machines to like print labels or get job reports or things like that. And so the easiest way, in their mind is to have like shared logins to those computer systems that are, on the shop floor. And that is also a security environment risk that you have maybe terminals that are always on, that they're not getting locked, or everybody knows the single password to those. Or if that's not the case, if they're logging in individually, which is the ideal, is maybe the file is locked to a certain user, and they got to go find that person on the shop. So there's some interesting, unique challenges with access, but generally we find that there's 20, 30 employees. There might be one or two of those that have network access. The foreman or the supervisor or manager has access to the system, and then all the others are just getting hard copies or reports of what's going on, and then clock in, clock out for time and things like that is maybe happening with like data labels, like barcode labels, so they can track the shipments across without having to log into the actual network infrastructure.
And are manufacturing companies still targets of ransomware the same as like we see large firms or casinos? And
Oh yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I think manufacturing companies have a lot of intellectual property, especially if they're dealing with, any high-tech manufacturing. Those drawing files and any files or have intellectual property. And the other thing that I've found is a lot of the manufacturers, they're producing equipment, producing product for a company that has some type of regulatory controls in place. So maybe you're producing medical equipment and you're supplying it to an integrator that has to be HIPAA compliant and maybe FDA compliant. And there's a lot of regulations around that. So those parts and pieces that they're manufacturing now are regulated. And from a ransomware standpoint, if a ransomware attack occurs to a manufacturer and locks up all their drawings and all their data, could be worth years of revenue to them if they can't get that back. So a ransomware attack could affect them being able to produce product in the future, and also they could lose contracts because they're now exposing confidential and regulated drawings and designs for medical equipment, or if you're a defense manufacturer, there's CMMC that's involved. And so these regulatory agencies, one of the reasons why they put, for example, CMMC in place in the Department of Defense production is these risks go all the way down to the manufacturer of the parts and pieces that go all the way into maybe a fighter jet. You might be making this one little widget, one little door hinge or something like that, but that result of a ransomware attack on that small manufacturer could result in production being held up to a fighter jet or to aircraft carrier. I mean, I'm just speculating here, but that's one of the reasons why these regulatory environments have become so dominant, because these ransomware attacks have caused problems in the whole supply chain. You know, defense or healthcare. There's a lot of issues that have occurred because of ransomware attacks or other type of hacking.
Well, and I imagine, it's in CMMC, but I imagine they don't want a lot of this information just getting out in addition to the shutdown of what's going on. They don't want that getting out to into the wrong hands.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. They could piece things together, whether it's going after the integrator or going after, individual manufacturers. They can start piecing things together and discovering, how the systems work based off of these 3D models, 3D engineering files that show how these systems work together. So it definitely, when you're dealing in the defense space, it's a huge risk. But it doesn't have to be defense. It could be, medical parts. It could be manufacturing of doors or construction equipment, things like that. A lot of companies have a unique way of doing things and a unique way of doing work, and the companies need to protect that so that a competitor or a bad actor doesn't have access to that data.
In addition to the ransomware or hacking risks, what other kind of risks might you mentioned, the kind of the challenges with old software, old gear and new gear. What are the consequences that they might face in something not working? I was reading like, even just like not being able to print shipping labels could really derail a business.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up. It's interesting that that's something that we ran into. So many years ago, we wrote a piece of software that was a production software for a manufacturer. They used labeling systems to track their orders all the way through to shipment. And if their label printer stopped working, they couldn't produce any work because everything was tied to these printers and these printing labels. And so, that something small like that, like a labeling device or, Wi-Fi going down that doesn't allow the scanners, the barcode scanners to read properly, those type of things can just majorly disrupt a manufacturing floor. One thing I would recommend to any manufacturer is you still have processes in place to keep production up, even in the event of an IT failure. So, and the name of it escapes me at the moment, but a tracking system, for your production across the floor, those pads of paper in a drawer somewhere, because systems go down and you don't want to stop production because you can't print a label or the barcode scanners don't work or the Wi-Fi goes down and you can't access the data shares. So if there's any way to still keep production up even without network availability, I think that's the way to look at it. And I think that's goes for any type of business as much as possible, but I think manufacturing is a big issue.
They're putting their disaster recovery plan together. What is like the number one thing they should do to keep, so they can keep running or recover quickly?
Yeah, I think disaster recovery, from a technology standpoint, first thing I would do, especially if your production floor is costing you a lot of money to keep up and running, is you have high availability in place. So your servers, because you most likely have servers on site, is that you have high availability of servers, automatic failover between hardware, running something like VMware or Proxmox or Hyper-V, so that you can automatically fail over if a piece of hardware fails. Maybe have some redundancy and backup of some of your core computer equipment too, core switches, things like that, if you have hardware failure. More likely than not, though, it's going to be some type of ransomware attack or network error. And so you want a really good disaster recovery backup plan in the office. So having another server that's taking snapshot images of your primary servers, those are disconnected from your regular network. So it's taking a snapshot, and if a ransomware hits, they don't have direct access to your backup system. And then you want to also back up those offsite so that if in the event that everything goes bad on site, you still have the ability to potentially recover from an offsite backup. So having, high availability, so redundant servers that are seamlessly working together, in case of a hardware, on-site high availability backups and off-site backups of those. And so that would be the first start to any disaster recovery plan that I would recommend. And these things have become a lot cheaper. It used to be hundreds of thousands of dollars to put this type of system together. Now it's tens of thousands of dollars, but it's definitely an insurance policy because one day lost of production could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to a manufacturer. Then, going back, having hard copies of production trackers so you know how to produce parts, keeping your current production, data files, your engineering files on maybe some USB drives, things like that. So you have some offline data if you do need to load drawings and engineering documents or data to the machines so that you can continue production in case servers go offline. And then finally, just if there's any way to have and operate off of paper, figure out a way and have people trained and maybe take, with your managers or staff, just take a half a day and say, okay, we're going to test this out and make sure that we can operate off of old school paper drawings and paper information and trackers on the production floor so that things can keep operating if crap hits the fan, worst case.
As we're working with people in this environment, who are we working with? Because it's probably not the company owner in this case.
Yeah, usually who we're working with is the COO or some type of ops lead is the one that we're putting these plans together. So their more intimate knowledge of the production floor. Oftentimes we'll work with like an engineering lead too, because the engineer team is highly involved in the IT operations. Are the ones that are using those data files, using the MRP ERP system constantly. Between this COO, some type of ops lead, maybe your engineering manager, and then the IT or MSP should be involved and develop this plan. And then you might want to bring in different people, bring in your shipping or warehouse manager to talk about that, bring in the finance people. If you don't have production quantities, how do you still ship? How do you track the shipments? Make sure billing still can happen when systems come back online. And then maybe the discussion with your key vendors. There's one of the things that is happening a lot in supply chain is supply chain resource management is ensuring that your suppliers are also putting these provisions in place. Because if you're relying on a third party to have parts coming in, let's say you are both a manufacturer and an integrator, one of your suppliers could cause you disruption from being able to send equipment out. So if you have any critical suppliers, you should be having the same discussions with them and review their disaster recovery plan to make sure that they are staying on top of these regulations, especially if you're, in a regulated environment. If you have to conform to CMMC, make sure that your vendors are also conforming to the same CMMC level that you are.
And to wrap it up, when we run a network assessment in an environment like this, how is it different than what we might do for like a financial or legal or something like that? How do we help identify those weak spots?
If the Windows NT machine is on the network, it might not be caught by a regular network scan. It might be different. Or, one of the things we do is we try to segregate those devices that can't be updated onto a internal network that's not accessible from the outside and doesn't have access to the outside. And so our network scan, if we're going to consult with a new company, wouldn't pick that up. We have to look at those machines individually, see how they're connected, see what credentials are being used. And so it's a little bit more manual process to review a company, especially has old equipment, and putting together a plan to make sure that those systems are secure is an essential part of it. So it is definitely more of a combined effort and complicated effort to understand how these manufacturers work and what all the integrations that are involved. In our company, we would have more people involved with that, and especially from a compliance standpoint, ensure that they understand the compliance requirements that the manufacturer falls under, and giving them an assessment on if they're complying with those requirements and coming up with a plan on getting into compliance.
All right. Well, thanks, Nathan. It's always interesting to talk about these things in different environments and see how it all works, because of course it's very important for our, to keep going with everything, that everything works.
Bringing back memories. Like I said, I've spent many years working with manufacturers. It's been a few years, but it's definitely a fun environment, and always enjoyed putting things together, and love the understanding how manufacturers are one of our sweet spots to deal with, because it's just, it's a kid tinker toys or Legos and building stuff, but it's for adults that much more complex and fun to do.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for listening.